Well, the New South Wales and South Australia have both moved to ease restrictions for border towns with Victoria. Both states bowing to growing pressure from not just frustrated residents, but the Prime Minister too.
Walking out and walking back South Australia's hard border closure.
The buffer zone that previously existed with Victoria will be reinstated as of Thursday night at midnight.
Border communities have been crying out for change, with the Prime Minister and Daniel Andrews lobbying privately for more flexibility. Now the Premier announcing relief for residents within 40 kilometres of the South Australian-Victorian border.
Now, there's one caveat on this, and that is that we don't have further community transmission in that western part of Victoria.
And there's more border backdowns coming, with residents of New South Wales and the ACT set to be allowed back in.
And if we continue to see very low levels like we've been seeing, it's quite possible that we will remove that requirement for 14 days self-isolation within the next 2 weeks.
It's been welcomed by the Federal Agriculture Minister.
A step in the right direction of common sense.
As he put the blowtorch on New South Wales to follow suit.
It would be hypocritical of New South Wales not to sit down with Victoria and try and do the same for the agricultural production systems.
Within hours, the New South Wales Deputy Premier standing in the border town of Albury announcing a breakthrough.
Of course, we're going to move away from the 2.5 kilometre bubble zone or border zone back to the original 50 kilometre border zone.
There's growing frustration amongst coalition MPs about the ongoing border closures. The Prime Minister telling the party room that whilst the issue is exasperating at times, the National Cabinet is the best way to resolve the issue.
Our goal should be to reopen Australia again, Mr Speaker, to reopen Australia right across the country to live with this virus.
And with relief for border communities in 3 separate states announced on Tuesday, there's optimism there could be more resolutions on the way. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Joining me now, Sky News contributor Graham Richardson. Richo, great to have you on board tonight. Look, it's a very challenging and vexed issue, these border closures. You can understand entirely why some politicians are going down that path. But the Prime Minister, really, I mean, National Cabinet is a great forum to try and butt their heads together, but he's tried and tried and tried. Doesn't seem to be getting too far on this.
No, he doesn't, but you know, I can understand why. I mean, if you're in Queensland that's had very few cases, you don't want them to come. So a politician like Palaszczuk jumps up and says, I won't let any bugger come over the border, I'll protect every one of you. They're obviously going to be popular, they'll do well. So it's very difficult. It runs counter to what the Prime Minister wants to do. What the Prime Minister wants to do is simply not what a lot of Australians want to do, even though I believe he's unquestionably right. The trouble is, as you would be aware, Peter, you know, fear is an easy thing to peddle in politics, very easy indeed. And fear is Trump's right now.
Yeah, well said, Richo. That's so true. All right, speaking of fear, Daniel Andrews is trying to extend the state of emergency in Victoria by 12 months. It's come under a lot of fire from certain politicians, particularly the opposition down there in Melbourne. Do you think he's bitten off a bit more than he can chew with this one, Richo?
Well, I suppose I don't have all the information he has, but 12 months does seem an awfully long time. It really does. And he's going to have to work pretty hard to justify that. If I were he, I'd think about it and probably shorten the time span. I mean, if you made it 6 months, I don't think people would be quite as alarmed as they are now, and yet you'd still be having a huge effect. I'd suggest that would be a course of action he ought to be considering, and he ought to be considering it quickly.
Richo, what did you make of the Mike Gunner victory in the Northern Territory? There was some suggesting that it wasn't as comprehensive as he might have hoped, but still, as you always say, Richo, you know, he did whatever it took to get the chocolates, and he's now still Premier, or Territory Leader, as they call them in the NT.
Yeah, a win's a win, and he's done that. He's got his 13, and I think he's a reasonable chance of getting 14, which is, you know, he'd love to have 16, but gee, 14's not bad when you've only got 25. So I'd say he'd be pretty happy with himself. Look, I mean, each electorate's only got 5,000 people, so it's quite possible over the course of a term for a member to get to know everyone. So incumbency is a huge advantage, massive in a place like that. And I think Gunner has shown exactly that. He's demonstrated that it's very hard to beat incumbency.
The Australian have been running some really good stuff, Richo, about the problems that exist between some of Australia's universities and their close ties to the Chinese. It certainly put a spotlight on, for example, what the CSIRO have been doing lately. And of course, we know that the Chinese have been, very punitive when it comes to sanctions on this country, particularly in the agricultural sector like beef and barley and, of course, wine. Does that concern you?
Well, the Chinese are very, very good at building and exercising soft power. And they've done that, and they've done it, I think, very well. So, some might say surreptitiously, but gradually they've just built up their power in some of our universities, and they have a lot of control. And I think that's something about which we should be concerned. I don't think that we're ever going to avoid the odd trade war with them. Like most bullies, they'll poke their tongue out at us and stick their middle finger up and make it hard for us. But we're going to have to get used to that. But I think it gives us an opportunity to look around the world and see what other markets there might be. We don't export much to South America. That's a market we should be exploring. And the Chinese may give us every reason to go a lot harder at something like that. And then we don't have to worry so much about them huffing and puffing the way they do now.
Richo, before we go, I mean, you can set your clock on this. Every couple of months there's a story on the front of the Oz that Michael McCormack's leadership of the Nationals is in trouble. I've got a couple of senior Nationals on the show coming up, so no doubt I'll ask them as well. What are your thoughts on McCormack and this continual speculation about whether he's the right man to lead the National Party?
Well, I think Matt Canavan is Barnaby Joyce's champion, and he just won't let go. He just keeps going on and on and on. I don't know how many ballots McCormack's got to win before people actually give him a bit of a go. I mean, you don't get much clear air when you've only been the leader for a while and you've already had three ballots and now he's the fourth. I think it's a bit rich. I'll be very surprised if he gets tossed. Something radical must have changed if that's the case. But it's just this continual frustration, and of course all it does is bring the National Party into some sort of public disrepute. It's not doing anyone any good, and I'll be very surprised if Barnaby Joyce turns out the winner.
Well, Graham Richardson, we've got Barnaby Joyce and, of course, Matt Canavan on the show later on tonight. So I'll tell you what, I'll ask them that question. Thanks for joining us tonight, Richo.
Good on you, mate.